Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andreea Dumitrașcu. I'm part of the Connect University team, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you today to another session of the Connect University Summer School 2021. With over 9,000 registrations from more than 70 countries across the globe, 16 inspiring sessions where 80 experts are explaining how can digital technologies be used to tackle climate change, both in terms of a greener digital system, as well as their role in helping reducing carbon emissions across industries. All the sessions are recorded and can be reviewed afterwards either directly on the Digital EU YouTube channel or on the Connect University webpage. Some other interesting sessions are in the program this week, so please check the program. The links are published already on Slido. And also don't forget about the certificates that you can get if you attend more than 7 lectures. For today's session on e-mobility for sustainability and competitiveness, we invite you to join us on Slido using the code e-mobility. I repeat, the code for Slido is e-mobility, one word. You can comment and ask us questions, and we will allocate them accordingly to our speakers. Also, please use the hashtag ConnectUniversity when sharing insights on the event on social media. Without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome our moderator of today, Felici Eduardo, Policy Officer at DG Move in the Unit of Sustainable and Intelligent Transport. Eduardo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andrea, and good afternoon to you all. Thank you very much for the invitation to be with you today. Unfortunately, the moderator that was planned for today was Christian Hedberg, my head of unit, but he has fallen ill. He was very much looking forward to this event, but he has to send his apologies and his regards. Nevertheless, it's a pleasure to discuss the themes of digital transformation and mobility with such highly distinguished speakers today. We have a great lineup, and they will address topics covering mobility as a service, circular economy, and smart cities. I think we will discover today that digitalization is a key driver for all these developments, and even the main driver for some. Let me start by introducing myself and today's speakers. So I'm a policy officer in the Sustainable and Intelligent Transport Unit at the European Commission's Transport and Mobility Department, DG Move. I'm very pleased to introduce today's topic from the perspective of the work of the European Commission, and then moderate the rest of the session with the speakers today. After my short introduction, we will then move on to Koen Kennis. He's Vice Mayor of the city of Antwerp, responsible for finance, mobility, SMEs, tourism, and intra-municipal decentralization. Koen is realizing a set of multimodal mobility projects and is creating a modal shift towards more durable ways of transport, public transportation, and shared mobility systems. It is therefore not a surprise he will address mobility as a service and modal shift from Antwerp's point of view. Following Koen, we will have a presentation by Tilman Vale, project lead of the Circular Cars Initiative Policy Workstream and coordinator of the CEID working group Circular Traction Batteries, working for Systemic. Tilman is leading projects related to the circular mobility and industrial solutions, with a focus on circularity for vehicle traction batteries and digital sustainable supply chain management. That's also the topic of his presentation today. After Tilman, we have Ida Schaumann. Ida is the head of government affairs at MaaS Global. She joined the Mobility as a Service operator at the beginning of 2020 to lead the work on policy and government affairs, after having worked on mobility issues for the Parliament of Finland as a consultant and as a full-time politician. She's also a city councillor and member of the City Council Governing Board of Turku in Finland. Her presentation is titled Mobility as a Service, the End of Car Ownership. And the last speaker in our lineup today is Matthew Richardson. He is Global Head of Electrification and Sustainability at Uber. His presentation is titled We're in it together, Partnering for Greener, Smarter Cities. Matthew leads Uber's work in the field of electrification, partnering with drivers, distributors, car makers, charging companies, and policymakers. He led the publication of Uber's 2020 Spark report, which discusses how the industry can work together in helping drivers to overcome barriers in moving to an electric vehicle. So that's today's lineup. I very much look forward to hearing from the speakers and to answering also some of the questions that you might have. I remind you to use the Slido to make sure that you send some questions to our speakers, and we'll try to address them right after their presentations. Before turning to them, I would like to kick off today's session with a short intro on what, in our view, from the perspective of the European Commission, digitalization of mobility can do to deliver on Europe's sustainability objectives. I will start by addressing the sustainability challenges we are facing related to transport, then follow up with the measures we are taking in the field of energy and fuels to conclude with an overview of our initiatives linked to digitalization and transport. Now, some of you might have heard that last December, the Commission presented the Sustainable and Smart Mobility Strategy. It lays the foundation for how the EU transport system can achieve its green and digital transformation and become more resilient to future crises. As outlined in the European Green Deal, another pillar which you might have heard of, the results should be a 90% cut in emissions by 2050, delivered by a smart, competitive, safe, accessible, and affordable transport system. To achieve these objectives, various milestones set a pathway for the green investments we all need to make. Now, for transport to become sustainable, in practice, this will mean, first of all, boosting the production and uptake of alternative, renewable, zero-emission, and low-carbon fuels in transport, and replacing existing fleets with cleaner vehicles. But we also need to increase the number of passengers traveling by rail and commuting by public transport, and by active modes, as well as make road freight less polluting. Thirdly, we need to implement the polluter pays and user pays principles without delay in all transport modes, in particular through carbon pricing and infrastructure charging mechanism. However, even more immediate reductions are needed for us to reach 2050 targets. We need to cut greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030. To make these reductions operational, the Commission is going to publish new proposals in mid-July, so in about a month and a half, as part of the Fit for 55 package, increasing the level of ambition for 2030. The Commission is proposing to revise CO2 emission performance standards for cars and vans, and all kinds of different directives and schemes to ensure this will be achieved. Beyond road transport, there are of course other modes, and we need to ensure that all the transport modes have meaningful alternatives at hand to decarbonize their operations. By 2050, we need to see a massive deployment of alternative fuels and clean options for planes, ships, and trains, as well as radically increased efficiency in their operation. So a progressive shift to zero-emission mobility is imperative. The digitalization, automation, the emergence of shared, collaborative economy and platforms are all disruptive trends challenging the current mobility and transport landscape. Now, data is key for these trends. One of the key tools to make these developments a reality, from our point of view, is the revision of the Intelligent Transport Systems Directive and the related delegated regulations. Since its adoption in 2010, the directive has been a driving force for the deployment of interoperable ITS services, intelligent transport systems, and the accessibility to data across the EU, such as eCall, you might know the emergency call system, and multimodal traveler information services. However, digitalization in transport is developing very fast, so we need to update this framework and set new priorities, together with all stakeholders involved, to make sure that it continues to contribute to green and digital transitions. This also requires rethinking the interaction of our framework with other policies, but also reminds us that we have to strengthen the cooperation with our stakeholders. The current focus within the ITS framework is on fostering development of multimodal digital mobility services through a set of related initiatives, all coming in 2022. Also, we will revise the delegated regulations to extend the geographical coverage and add new data types, and we will continue to support deployment of cooperative, connected, and automated mobility. Now, these initiatives will also contribute to building a common European mobility data space. The latter will become a combination of the existing transport and mobility data, organized to allow for easy reuse and the development of services and analyses, including based on artificial intelligence. This mobility data space will not replace or merge existing data sources, but establish a unified way for discovery and access to these resources. The goal is to raise awareness of existing and new data users and on data outside their traditional habitat, and to foster the linking of these data for even smarter transport analysis and services. To conclude, we can say that in Europe, we are on the right track to develop a new kind of mobility. Mobility data becomes increasingly available and is of high quality. We're also investing in smart infrastructure, collaborating with and supporting vehicles, and allowing the sharing of data in real time. I hope this introduction, this very short intro, gave you a glimpse of what we're currently working on. It is, of course, too much to mention in just a short introduction, but I hope it gives you some ideas of the direction that we're taking in terms of our policy initiatives. It's also, of course, too much, but it illustrates the challenges Europe is facing in terms of mobility and sustainability. We will respond to these challenges, but as I mentioned earlier, it is imperative that we strengthen our collaboration in order to face them successfully. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing the presentation of the upcoming speakers. So we will start, as I mentioned, with Koen. Koen, the floor is yours for your presentation.
Thank you. I hope you hear me. Yes, okay. First of all, I want to thank you, Eduardo, and also Connect University for the invitation. It's for me a great honor to explain here in front of this group the way, the experience we in Antwerp have with new mobility solutions. The topic of mobility is at this moment at the crossroad of public and private demands, and we all have a stake in it. You, me, we all need mobility. It's also at the crossroad of environmental and economical demands. How to balance economy and environmental challenges. Mobility is also a field in which innovation takes place at an ever-increasing speed. And the Antwerp City Council is aware of that and is developing a mobility policy accordingly. Antwerp is a perfect setting to do so. Antwerp is a city where old and new, so you can see Antwerp then also. Antwerp is a city where old and new meet. We have old industries like the diamond trade and the port, but we have also culture and innovation and doing things different. Antwerp is an industrial city and a student city, a city of culture and entrepreneurship. First, some context perhaps, some facts and figures about Antwerp. It is the biggest city in Flanders. We have 528,000 inhabitants, 40,000 students, 250,000 commuters and 80,000 companies. And I can say one huge traffic problem. This is caused by the fact that Antwerp hosts the second biggest port in Europe, Antwerp's central location also in Europe, at the crossroads of several major transport links, and a ringway that was built in the 60s and which was constructed too close to the city center. These problems are costing Antwerp and the Flemish economy a lot of money. Decades have been lost in endless procedures to tackle this problem. Only recently, under the previous and the current city council and regional governments, progress has been made. Giant infrastructure works are being carried out in order to complete the ringway, take it partially underground, and improve both reachability and livability of the city. But this city council knows very well infrastructural works are not enough. Antwerp develops a strategy in order to engage inhabitants and visitors to rethink the way they travel to the city and, of course, also the way they travel inside the city. This is why Smart Ways to Antwerp was launched. Smart Ways to Antwerp starts from user-centric mobility. It recognizes that mobility depends on the context of the user and recognizes that every user is unique. This means that the user should have the freedom to choose how to move around. Sometimes the best option for the user will be walking, another time it will be driving. Giving freedom to choose also means that a wide range of options should be offered. To make sure that the user can always choose for the best mobility solution, we've attracted smart mobility solutions to Antwerp. This ranges from shared micromobility like e-scooters, bikes, and even in the near future, e-bikes for the whole regional transport, organization. To cargo bikes, yes, also cargo bikes are in there for neighborhoods or even electrical cars. Blindly offering the mobility solution does not make the user switch to the better solution. So through Smart Ways to Antwerp, we support them, the various users, in making the smartest choices. We do this by providing the right information at the right time, by offering an intermodal route planner, unique in the world, by giving various types of incentives, and by using various nudging techniques to change the user's behavior. In the end, we make sure that users helps us in reaching our city objectives. As said, every user is unique and has their own context, but it's not possible for us as a city to work on an individual level. Therefore, we target via groups like inhabitants, visitors, employers, and employees. And by monitoring and evaluating user behavior on a regular basis, we can easily and quickly shift and validate if our efforts create the right results. I will take now one theme per step to explain a little bit more. The first, put the user central. We have to respect the user's needs, habits, and we develop our policies not to force people into a certain direction. We develop our policies by taking people by the hand in the choices, to seduce them, in fact, seduce them into rethinking and maybe changing their behavior. Because, ladies and gentlemen, in a lot of cases, people choose today automatically to take their car to go, for instance, from home to work, because that's the most easy solution. A car is indeed maybe the best solution to move around, nor is public transport or a bicycle or e-moped or an e-scooter. It all depends on the context of why you move and with whom. In earlier times, if you really wanted to have the best solution to move from point A to point B, you would need a garage full of vehicles, a car for the longer rides with the family, a good bike for the shorter trips, a scooter for those solo trips in between, a cargo bike to transport slightly bigger objects within the city, or a van to move a bigger stuff, and so on and so on. And for instance, walk to the bus or train station. This is why people, in many cases, people choose, and if you see to the reality, people have chosen in many cases for their own car and perhaps some bikes, for instance, for the children. In reality, and today we can do it different. The advantages in technology these days make that you not longer need to have to own all those vehicles yourself, but you can get access to them based on your need, based on the context of your mobility needs, like your CDs and DVDs that you no longer need to own thanks to Netflix and others. You don't need to own a vehicle anymore, but you can still if you want. Those are the smart solutions we focus on today. Enable people to choose. Through our marketplace for mobility, we support all the players with communication, project calls, integration, challenges, and help them to build their businesses so that they can focus on creating the best user experience that also support the goals of the city. In reality, when you look in Antwerp, we now have 3 bike sharing systems. We have 2 e-moped sharing systems. We have 3 e-scooter sharing systems. We have 2 bigger e-car sharing systems, or 3 in fact. We have different public transport, of course, trams, buses, trains, and of course people have their own vehicles also. And if you look to that, people have a choice. If I want to go to the city, I can go, for instance, to the city with public transport, with the tram, and I can come back with the sharing bike. And that's very easy because I don't need to own it. I don't need to care for it. I only have to use it on a simple way. If you have a lot of mobility solutions, it does not get more difficult to make the right choice. If you have all those solutions, how do I have to make the choice? And we want to support the user in making the right choice through various channels. To make the right choice, the first thing the user needs is the right information. Via the website and app of Smart Ways to Antwerp, we offer neutral and up-to-date information on all mobility solutions available. One of the tools we use for this is an intermodal route planner. This route planner is unique in the world. not even Google can do what we do. The routing is not only focused on the city of Antwerp, but functions for the whole of the Benelux, since we all know that everybody wants to come and visit our beautiful city. The route planner from Smart Ways to Antwerp is unique because it's the only which can combine multiple modes in one trip advice. Best example is taking the car to the train station or the park and ride, switch to the public transport and finish the trip then with a Veloke. That's one of our shared bike systems. Standard, the smartest solution, is offered to the user, but he can also fine-tune suggestions based on his preferences. Although we already have a high-performing route planner, we're improving it even more and implementing more mobility solutions as we speak. Big players said it was impossible. We've proven them wrong, and with your help, we're planning to create solutions to things big players say they are impossible to solve. Since we've proven we can accomplish the impossible, we've set a new challenge for ourselves, and that's the development of an international turn-by-turn, an intermodal, turn-by-turn navigation app. We're making great progress with the development, and I hope I can uncover some of this soon. So not only it will help you to choose, but the route planner will also help you in the future by going on your trip, and will explain you when you have to change from mode, how you have to walk from the point where you get out the train, for instance, and where you have to pick up your shared bike. Of course, route advice and navigation is one thing, paying and unlocking is another thing. And I see that I forgot to go further in my slides. So, support smart choices. As a city, we could have chosen to extend the route planner even more and integrate also booking and unlocking functionality in our app. We've been tempting to do just that, but mobility is bigger than the city limits. Our cities have created their own app uniquely. Other cities, have created their own app uniquely integrating the mobility solutions of their city, but we recognize that mobility goes beyond the city limits, even beyond the country limits. Therefore, we've chosen to support mobility as a service providers in launching their services in Antwerp. We actively support them in their technological development and help them with the integration of various mobility solutions. This has resulted in multiple mobility as a service providers who offer access to a wide range of mobility solutions in various business models. I think on B2C, B2B, B2B2E, so a lot of possibilities are available. Some of the most active players are Transer, for example, offers access to mobility solutions in Belgium and the Netherlands with focus on Antwerp. Skipper offers intermodal trip advice and access to many solutions in Antwerp and Brussels. Olympus Mobility has a great B2B offer and of its own and has a B2C offering through the KBC banking app. And WIM, you can book various solutions all over the world and also in Antwerp. Next to these players, there are also many smaller players who combine mobility solutions in a unique customer value proposition, which we support. Like with Belgian beers, MaaS comes in with flavors. What brings them all together is creating a seamless travel experience for their users. We also oblige the suppliers of shared mobility to integrate with at least 3 MaaS suppliers, of which 2 should be MaaS operators with a B2C, business to consumer program, so directly to the people. To reach a broad audience and support as many players as possible, we target via groups. We help logistical players with pilot projects like DHL and the rollout of cargo bikes for urban deliveries, and it's very successful. CEO events to inform employers and all the various ways they can support their employees in making the smartest mobility solution, and offer trials offers to organizations so that employees can test out the various mobility solutions and more. And I can, to give you an idea, it helps very good. We saw that we had a lot of problems with traffic jams on the classic times when home work travel and work home travel was going around, with commuters, of course. And we said, how can we make there a shift? Because that was very important, to do a shift from the own car to other solutions. And we get into contact via the employers. We could take contact with the employees and encourage them to change their behavior, to change their way of traveling to work. And to help them, we have a lot of test bicycles, test subscriptions, so they can try it a week, 2 weeks, and afterwards a lot of people say, okay, I don't go back anymore. I stay on that different, on that change. I changed my behavior. I'm gonna bike to work instead of drive to work with my car. All of this would be useless if it doesn't support our goals, of course. Therefore, it's key to monitor and evaluate also. And we do it continuously. Through this continuous monitoring, we see that our approach works also. As an example, you can see the results of our employers' approach, where I was just talking about. We advised 46 companies and gave their more than 30,000 employees access to the right information and access to various mobility solutions. 50% of that people, of the people who tested a vehicle, said right after the test they would purchase the vehicle. 29% also actually did it, and 49% that regularly used the car. And of the 49% that regularly used the car, 20% was switching and has switched to another solution. We see similar results through the various tracks that we've set up, and we believe we've also had a positive impact on the bottom line of all the mobility providers, because we bring them really customers who stay also customer. To give you an idea, the more options we offered, the more mobility went up. If you offer quality and build infrastructure accordingly, they will come on. And here you see how shared bikes, shared mopeds, shared kick scooters, shared cars was growing in Antwerp over the last, let's say, 10 years, with a really very tough sprint at the end from 2017. And it results, except for school-related transport, the use of private vehicles went down. For the school-related transport, the use of private vehicles was already very low, around 10%. For the other, it went down, for instance, for commuting from 50% to 35%. For leisure, from 42% to 30%. So it went down, and the blue lines are the bikes, and you see that bikes is going up. And I can give you also that, for instance, in Antwerp, the e-bike and the speed pedelec has really been looked as a game changer, because a lot more people used it. You also see that a lot of people, you see it not very good in these first figures, but also when you look to others, we see also there growing things, and that's more or less the shared scooters, for instance. What I see is that MaaS is essential for mobility of the future. Mobility as a service will be the next big thing. As a city, we want to make sure that the mobility sector is open also for innovation, open for collaboration, and open for participation, because without that, we can't reach our goals. We stimulate mobility players to collaborate with MaaS providers, and together with all stakeholders, we actively push for agreements and collaborations which create a triple win. A win for the city, a win for the mobility and the MaaS provider, and a win for the users. So a win for all stakeholders. That's where we are looking for. In short, we're open for business as a city. Let's further develop Antwerp into a living lab for real smart mobility solutions. Get in touch. The world is already looking at Antwerp when it comes to multimodality. Join us and work together with us on a better, a more livable, more agreeable city. Thank you. Please, Eduardo, back to you.
Thank you very much, Koen. I just had to wait for the director to unmute me before I could take over. Thank you very much for this very, very interesting presentation that you gave. I think it really shows what can be done with data, with innovation, with apps and smartphones, and that this new world is bringing us all kinds of ways to travel and to change the way mobility works in the city of Antwerp. I wanted to address one of the questions, since we have a few minutes, that we have received from the viewers today via Slido. I remind you that viewers can pose questions via Slido. Now, of course, all these changes have implications also on the infrastructure of the city. You mentioned the 1960s ring that you have, the ring road. You cannot simply magically remove that. But of course, we want to change things like being able to add charging infrastructure, being able to change the place where the shared mobility comes together. What is Antwerp doing in terms of changing the actual infrastructure of the city?
We are doing different things. One is completing the ring road so that we have less cars that are traveling around the city or that have to travel bigger parts of the city, that they don't get with the car in the city, on our streets where people are living, where people are recreating, where people are walking. So when they are on the ring road, they are on a highway, there they can drive through easily. Second thing is, of course, that we also are working on our streets. In our medieval center, we change our streets to what we call woonerven, living streets, you could say, that are streets where there is a shared use of the street by the pedestrians, the bicyclists, and the cars that need to be there. In fact, we don't want to have too many cars, but for instance, for people who live there, for deliveries to stores, for people who go to their hotel, for instance, you need those possibilities. And so that will be made really low car numbers. And then we have our bicycle streets, where bicycles are the first user of the street, of the part where also cars drive, and cars have are a guest in that street and have to stay behind the bicycles, so the bicycles are king on that street. And we try to do that in the different parts of the city, and of course, what we are also improving are what we call our bicycle highways, our bicycle network, because we see more and more people are bicycling in the city, and we try to also get that infrastructure up. And that means, for instance, always having broader and broader bicycle paths, because there are also different types that are driving now there, e-scooters, but also the classical bikes, of course, but also the e-bikes and the speed pedaling, so different speeds. So we need more space for bicycles systematically in the city.
Thank you very much for that reply. Let me also take then one last one. And that's related to the jobs. Do you think e-mobility will put jobs at risk in Antwerp?
I don't think e-mobility will put jobs at risk in Antwerp. Our city is changing continuously, and that means also that always new companies are coming in. And for instance, when I look to the platforms that are in here now and that deliver the sharing mobility solutions, they create even new employment, new businesses, new jobs in the city. I don't saw at this moment really jobs falling away.
Great, that's very promising to hear. Thank you very much, Koen. Fantastic to hear what Antwerp is doing. Let's move on to the next speaker of today, which is Tilman Val. Go right ahead, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Eduardo, and thank you for the host for inviting us to speak. As mentioned in the beginning, I'm with Systemic. For those who don't know us, we are an impact organization for profit for impact, founded 2016 after the Paris Agreement. We've since grown to 300 employees globally in 5 offices with several hundred projects live. And our entire purpose is to support the economy to transition to a more sustainable setting that supports a long-term prosperity of humanity. And so today I'm going to speak to you and discuss with you how to accelerate electric mobility with a digital circular economy, which we believe is critical to making the electric mobility transition viable and sustainable. And I'm going to talk about how, in what context, and what role digital means can play. Now, to start off with and set the scene, why do we need to move so fast? And we've seen it in the recent action by the European Commission and European institutions as well. We have about 1 decade to cut global emissions by half, according to leading science. And so decarbonizing, among others, transport systems is, of course, critical. And there were a few great questions in the chat already. What role electric mobility will play then, what challenges exist? So we need to move fast. So far, so good. But besides the carbon question, there's actually other aspects to consider as well, including that, of course, the transport sector, producing cars, producing roads, and so on, is a major source of resource extraction as well. And so resource extraction, besides carbon impacts, has a lot of other environmental impacts globally. 90% of global biodiversity losses and water stress, 50% of the CO2 emissions, and 1/3 of all air pollution health impacts actually come from resource extraction and processing. So this is another side of the environmental impacts we cannot leave out of our focus. Now, we might think that as we progress technologically, resource productivity increases, and so we kind of innovate our way out of the challenges. But in fact, material productivity has been plateauing for several decades now. And if the trends continue, our resource extraction will continue to rise quite intensely across the globe. So there's clearly something we need to do about that in order to stay within the planetary boundaries for our common prosperity, and circular economy is certainly one way of doing that. Now, again, focusing on transport sector, in the EU, the transport sector contributes about 32% of CO2 emissions, and road transport, so cars, a total of 15%, so that's a big chunk of the climate story. And then also indirect or different impacts from resource consumption, as just mentioned. So before diving into what circular economy does and what digital means do in this setting, to set the scene, it's important to get straight what do electric cars actually do in terms of climate impacts and resource consumption. And there's an incredible study by the Joint Research Center of the European institutions that has done probably the most comprehensive environmental impact assessment of electric cars, or of all sorts of propulsion systems of cars, and finds that in fact, even today already, electric cars consistently perform substantially better than all other powertrains. So it is today the most sustainable form of car propulsion. You see here 45% of the total life cycle footprint of a combustion engine car is what the electric car would bring on the road today. And even in a high coal-heavy energy grid like that in Poland, for example, in the European Union, it still has an improvement over conventional propulsion systems. And what we also see is that until 2030, we expect this advantage to dramatically increase further, so cutting the footprints by half again. Now, of course, we're just at the beginning of electric mobility, and so there's lots to be still done to further improve that. And what that involves is particularly using more renewable energy in the use phase, so charging electric cars with renewable energy, of course, and also producing, especially the batteries, with more renewables, ensuring that the materials that we use, one of the questions related to lithium extraction, for example, responsibly. And so we'll get to how a digital product passport, how digital means can support that. And lastly, applying circular economy principles. Now, just in order to give an order of magnitude how fast that might go, there's different forecasts how rapidly electromobility will take place. And just for reference, how fast the digression of costs has happened over the last years, and similar to the trends in photovoltaics, all the forecasts that had been made in the past have consistently been slower than the actual real-life progress. So whenever you read forecasts about how fast electric mobility and these decarbonizing technologies take place, keep in mind that these are projections from a current perspective, and in the past have consistently been outpaced by reality. And on the flip side to this, the current industries, so oil industries, for example, coal industry for the power sector, again, their projections had been too optimistic in the past, and have been shown to be corrected down as time moved on. So we can expect actually this trend to accelerate even further than we believe today. Now, how fast will it go and how big will it get? In a 2019 study, the World Economic Forum estimated that by 2030, the global battery demand for, the demand for all types of large batteries or batteries in total would increase 14-fold, with a biggest substantial change in electric mobility. And therefore substantially increase, of course, the positive climate effects, but also the potential environmental burdens that could take place due to the trend and change to electric mobility. And so that, of course, means that while lithium-ion batteries as the driver for electric mobility, for the large chunk of that, are an amazing tool to decarbonize our transport and lower its environmental impacts, and also are a great opportunity for economic development in the European Union. They require, of course, lots of new technological developments, lots of new materials. Lithium, cobalt, nickel are a few of the well-known candidates. And so we require adequate resource management in order to ensure that we actually use this for the good and decouple our well-being and the developments from resource consumption and impacts. Now, the European Union has, of course, recognized this, and in the new European Circular Economy Action Plan and European Green Deal, we find that the circular economy, one that decouples prosperity and wealth from resource use, is both in focus and very explicitly mentioned, and a comprehensive program has been designed for it, as well as the circular economy supports many of the other actions of the European Green Deal. So for transport as a whole, or the car industry as a whole, we are Systemic, together with the World Economic Forum and industrial partners, we've been working on developing this in a bit more detail. What could this mean, circular economy for the automotive sector, and what policies would have to be implemented or could provide good guidance to shape this transition. You see from the forward by the European Commission for Transport, Adina Valian, we've engaged quite closely with the European Commission until here now, of course, looking forward to developing this further with the Circular Cars Initiative to develop a comprehensive pathway to getting circular economy action going in the automotive space. Now, for batteries in particular, the Circular Economy Initiative Germany has been working on frameworks and recommendations for driving this forward, both from policy and industry side. And how we conceptualize circular economy for batteries is not only recycling, but far from it or beyond that. Recycling as a necessary and critical element to the end of life of a battery, but only part of the story. But instead, additional measures that are part of the circular economy are, of course, repairing, refurbishment, and reusing batteries after their useful life in a car, but also intensifying the use of them while they are in use, for example, through grid services, vehicle-to-grid, vehicle smart charging, as well as car sharing. And through all these, we believe that there's massive potential for both economic value and improving environmental footprints. And so from our analysis, we estimate that the total potential for improving the lifetime CO2 footprint of large batteries in cars could be up to about 40%. So that includes all the measures just mentioned, up to 40% of the life of a battery. That is only indirectly though, and so directly though, so of the battery itself. But we also need to consider that a battery electric car is inherently a part of the power system, right, as it's being charged and potentially also discharged. And if that is managed well through smart charging and bidirectional charging, this could actually mean that electric cars themselves could become a critical element in decarbonizing the power grid by getting more renewable energies into the grid. And an analysis by McKinsey finds that this could actually reduce total CO2 emissions by 2.6 gigatons of CO2 in 2030 globally, which is a substantial share of global CO2 footprint. So really leveraging the electric cars in the power grid for good as well. So besides the environmental footprint, there's also the economic case for this. So circular economy through vehicle-to-grid, there could actually be new revenue models that come for a car owner, where they could be compensated for providing charging service or grid services from their car. So basically get paid for balancing the grid, for example, then extending the lifetime of a battery through the reuse or putting it into a second life application, that is into stationary application in a grid application. That could also lower costs, and of course recycling, recovering those precious metals in the battery at end of life also can add value, and so that in total could lower the cost of a battery by about 20%. And with these effects, this could lead by these analyses to an increase from the 14-fold demand compared to today by 2030 to a 19-fold, so a substantial uptake, an additional boost to electric mobility. And so, of course, this only works if the system around the electric cars functions right, if the market conditions exist, if the data exists, so the batteries can be integrated into the grid, that the second life applications, the kind of second-hand market for electric car batteries is working efficiently, and that the recyclers actually know what to do with the batteries at end of life to actually capture as much of the valuable materials through recycling as possible. So one milestone from policy side that happened last year was the passing of the draft of the battery regulation by the European Commission, which is due to be passed into law end of this year, beginning of next. And among many visionary rules and circumstances that are ingrained in this regulation, the improvement of data, and particularly through an electronic data exchange system and through a so-called battery passport is at the core of this regulation as a key enabler to actually make this happen. And this is where we're going to dive into in the next coming minutes. So batteries, of course, are inherently a digital product, right? So like a large lithium battery, you cannot turn on and off really. It's always live as soon as it's in a car, as soon as it's produced, and it's always going to be managed digitally through the battery management system. And so there's lots of data that is internal to the battery, but now also integrating it into power grid and actually reading how the state of the battery is can only work in a digital fashion. And so the availability of the data to actually enable digital tools for smart circular economy is quite critical, and these have to be collected and stored and accessed throughout the life of a battery. And so that is why the battery passport as a prototype, if you will, is the first example of a digital product passport has been written into this law, legal draft, and why it's been on the agenda by the European Commission for such a long time, and by many others, in fact. So if we look at the reason why, if you look at any product like the battery, across the production and life cycle, you'll have many information that are being produced, but most of them are confidential, are not standardized, only happen to be exchanged between individual actors, and then much of that information is lost. And so for a circular economy, this information would be highly valuable in order to actually get these activities going that we just mentioned. And so a digital product passport could actually be one really very much like a passport of a human. Be started at the birth, if you will, and then carry information across its life cycle in order to get that economic activities going. And the benefits are manifold, and I won't go into all of these here in detail due to time, but basically if you look across the life cycle for car manufacturers, this can actually help lower their costs at end of life. It can also lower their costs for liabilities and help them monetize the battery data that they have anyway, right? If they're able to safely and securely transfer them and trade them with other partners. For the logistics providers at end of life, having safety relevant information is key to actually transport batteries efficiently. And the same for secondhand users, for example, having safety and value assessment is critical. The same for recyclers. And then for the public side, for society, it's actually key to have a sustainable and efficient market for these batteries, and also create more transparency about raw material availability, of where are these batteries, how sustainable are they, of course, and potentially also use this information to support sustainability action like safety registration. So for some examples of where are we with the so-called battery passport, there is no battery passport yet. It's drafted in the regulation, but there's many actors that are already active in the field and in many different places. So the Global Battery Alliance, initiated by the World Economic Forum, they proposed a concept for a battery passport, a global battery passport, that includes also auditing rules and access to governmental organizations, and this concept would be a global common good concept, right? So one that is not proprietary to any company or any value chain actor, but really is the intermediary to get the circular economy and sustainability going. Others are in the space already, like individual companies, for example, one of them being Circular, others are there as well, that provide the secure aggregation of data all the way up to the mine, collecting this data, providing that for the relevant players along the value chain safely, and also analyzing this in order to, for example, create more sustainable value chains as the battery is produced and then used. And so the key here is that there is permission-based access to data and the ability to add further data as the battery lives throughout its life cycle, very much like if in a passport you would stamp visa stamps, where have you been, is everything in order, changes of your address, for example. And then there's non-commercial actors such as GS1, which is the operator of the barcode, which has identified the opportunities to support this trend as well through its unique identifier approaches and existing and emerging systems like the GS1 digital link and the GS1 web vocabulary, which are meant to support and stabilize really the exchange of these data. Now, last but not least, I mentioned the Circular Economy Initiative Germany in the beginning. That is one initiative that Systemic has been driving for a while with the German automotive and industrial sector and sciences, as well as civil society and academia. And we worked intensely for about a year on traction batteries, published a report on it. And with this group, we're currently setting up a consortium to develop this type of battery passport for sustainability and support the European Commission in getting this into reality and on the market, so to speak, for all batteries in order to support the circular economy and sustainability. And with that, just to allow me to summarize briefly. So circular economy is critical to make electric mobility both more sustainable than it already is, and also improve its economics further. The circular economy is really a central pillar of the European policy part, and also including industrial and decarbonization policy. And digital tools really are crucial in order to actually make this happen and get this on the ground, if you will. And so the battery passport is one of the key ones. The data space mentioned in the beginning is also critical. And so the battery regulation, if you haven't looked into it, I really recommend it. I recommend looking it up. It's a milestone for regulation and hopefully passing, and it could set the foundation to actually put these into practice and get the circular economy for electric vehicle batteries into reality. And with that, I'm looking forward to questions, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Tilman. That's fantastic. Very, very rich presentation. And I think you answered quite some questions that we received via the Slido on the environmental impacts and aspects of e-mobility. Maybe just a quick one before we move on to Ida. Is there any research analyzing if there's any meaningful appetite of electric vehicle owners to use green energy only? That's what Alexander asks us.
Yeah, and as we saw from that life cycle analysis, that's critical, right, to actually get that going. So there's two sides to it, maybe three. So for one, currently renewables tend to be more expensive in the market than conventional fossil produced energy sources. That is bound to change. So over the coming years, we see many markets where renewables are actually cheaper to produce than fossil fuel energy. And so as soon as that is the case, I mean, why would people use more expensive energy? And that's the first. The second one is that I mentioned these vehicle to grid and smart charging applications where you could actually, kind of lease out your car, the battery in your car, to help the grid and earn some money with that. That requires some regulation as well. So basically the market rules that allow operators to price it, and that is quite important, and that is happening at European level and should be harmonized further. And so there's some things still to do to make that happen and possible. And then thirdly and lastly, there's most of the large OEMs, so the car producers, they offer power contracts with electric cars when you buy them or lease them, and they tend to be green power contracts, right? And so they have an inherent interest, so they can show that they actually have the best possible environmental outcome. And so there's maybe also some give and take between the industrials and the users.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that very comprehensive answer. Let me remind all the participants that you can ask questions to our speakers here today via Slido, so feel free. And I'll try to move them or ask them to to the speakers on your behalf. So let's jump right to Ida Schaman's presentation from MaaS Global. Ida, go ahead, the floor is yours. And I think Ida needs to be unmuted before she can take the floor.
Now you can hear me, maybe?
Yes. Welcome.
And you can see a normal slideshow, not the presenter view, I hope.
I actually see the presenter view myself.
Okay, well, sorry, I'll just go from the normal one then. Does it look normal?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect.
Right ahead. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Eduardo, and good afternoon to everybody. Hello, greetings from Helsinki. My name is Ida Schaman, and as Eduardo said, I work as the policy lead, the head of government affairs at MaaS Global, which is the first MaaS operator in the world. But one thing that I rarely share in my speaker bio is that I actually have a background in horseback riding. I had a horse back in the day, and I think it's always funny to present that now, because if you think back 110 or 120 years ago, that was a normal skill for any person in society. Everybody would know how to ride. And now, 120 years later, barely anyone does. And I think that's a good way to start. And also when talking about car ownership, to remember how much we've changed as a society as a whole, how much cities have changed, but also how much the car has changed the world, because we skipped horses because there was a better product, and that's something that we're really trying to do at MaaS Global as well. I also think it's interesting to say, as a detail about history, is that very few people used to own a horse back in the day. They actually rented them. So the ownership part is actually quite new as well, historically. But what would it take to give up your car? This is the question that we really think about at MaaS Global all the time. What we have developed as the first MaaS operator is a MaaS solution. And our goal is really to have 1 million people, 1 million car owners switch their cars for a WIM subscription. So our app is called WIM because we want people to be able to go wherever they want to go on a whim, just like you can with a car. Because we do believe in, and fundamentally we think that the reason we haven't been able to rival the car with public transport, with separate modes of transport, is simply because people still think the car is more convenient, is easier. And I think that's fair to say, because I especially as a city councillor myself as well, it's fair to give that to the car. It's an amazing product, and it has won over the world, so to speak. So our solution is really an app for the consumer. But what it is, it includes everything from routing information, tickets. We also have in-app payment, and we have different sort of packages of mobility. And I think this is important to realize. We've been called the Netflix of mobility. I think Koen as well mentioned Netflix in this context earlier today. And I think it's important to realize that MaaS is not just sort of like a blockbuster catalog in your phone. If you compare it to Netflix, it is actually a solution, and that's where we want to go. So it's a mobility service, not just a, how should I say it, an Amazon of mobility where you can just pick and choose. We actually do want to provide that service and that solution where the customer can move just like with a car, but combining different modes of transport. And during the years, we're really happy. We've gotten a lot of positive attention, and I do think there is, I mean, the reason or the sort of interest in MaaS globally, and also by DG Move, so thank you for that. One of the reasons for that interest is because we do need a solution, and this is something that technology really, I mean, the theme of today and of this series is how the digital world can help solve challenges of society. And I think this is something where MaaS can be a very powerful tool for Europe, but for the whole world. And I think that's why we do get a lot of attention for MaaS. As has been said today many times, I think we all know this, we need to decarbonize transport. While we look at different sectors, transport emissions do continue to increase. It's not because we're bad at decreasing emissions, but it is because people move more and continue to do that. And as we can't forbid people to go anywhere, we have to find solutions where they can do that sustainably. I won't go through the emission statistics, but I think I would like you to look at the 38%, because 38% of people would give up their car if they only could. So there's, and just looking at Europe, for example, that's 70 million cars off European roads. So there is a growing ground. There are a lot of people that think they would prefer something else. They might not think it's a sound investment to have a car, for example. And if we can tap into that, and if we can offer those people something that is more sustainable, and maybe especially in cities, something that doesn't take up as much space, that could be used for living, that could be used for people, then we could really see a huge change all over the world. And if you look at more of the sort of, if you look at the economics of it, I think it's good to remember, I don't think we all think about this too much, but if you do own a car, that monthly average for that car that you actually pay is around 600 euros a month. And that's actually a lot of money. That's like rent for a small apartment here in Helsinki is half of that, actually. So it's a big lump of money that people put into transport. And that's also one of the reasons, and I think one of the reasons many companies see an economic potential in this, because there is sort of a lot of funds that could be used in a different way, and that could be used to be funding something else, something more sustainable. And that's also why investors, you can see this sort of graph on the right, really do see that MaaS will, well, not take over the world, but grow exponentially in the coming years. We also know that private cars are, it says private car share, but the share of private cars of the transportation cost is 76%. So it is really cars we spend this money on. So if we can tap into that, we can not just save the planet, hopefully, but also actually create quite a lot of economic growth. And then just to remind you all, I think everybody knows this, but that car that you might or might not own actually sits unused 96% of the time, which of course, again, when it comes to, well, a city like Antwerp or any city in the world, means that there's a lot of space that is being taken up by cars that aren't used, and it's not very, very efficient. Well, then, I mean, I think the big question is with MaaS is always how do we do this? What's needed for this to happen? And I usually talk about MaaS standing on a tripod, like you can see here. There are three main things that are needed if you think more as a policy professional, which I am. So the first thing is access to high quality data. In order for MaaS to function, MaaS needs to be able to tap in to the data, the information of different transport services. So that's really the first step there. And for example, for WIM or MaaS Global, we don't have any transportation modes ourselves. We don't own any vehicles. So what we do is actually we resell services of other services. So we work together, and in order to be able to do that, we need to be able to integrate those services into our app, because that's when it becomes a really added value for the consumer, when they can actually use the app for everything. They don't need to download 5 other apps to access their transportation, and that's why we need interoperable systems. And interoperable systems is really systems that talk to each other. So open APIs, for example, that are accessible. And here, I mean, the European Commission is doing a lot of work, and a lot of work has also been done in several countries in Europe. And then thirdly, the important thing, especially if MaaS is to be a foundation for economic growth, which I think everybody wants it to be, and also for consumers to have as many options as possible, there is a need for a level playing field, so to speak. So functioning competition, functioning, which as with any market, we're creating a new market here when it comes to MaaS. And of course, a new market needs clear rules for all of those involved in that market. And I just wanted to lift up some, well, of course, Antwerp you already heard about. It's a really good example of policy where MaaS has been enabled. If you want to read more, in the Netherlands, there are pilots going on now, several of them, where MaaS is being promoted. In Finland, there is the Finnish Transport Act, which is really the first piece of MaaS legislation in the world that was entered into force in 2018. And then, well, this summer, actually, we have the French law on mobility, which just entered into force, or I think it's maybe in July that all of it enters into force. So that remains to be seen. But a lot of work is being done on the policy side to enable MaaS and to sort of unlock that potential and at least give MaaS sort of the breathing room to grow. Because of course we don't know how it will develop yet. It's quite new, but that way it at least has the room to do so. And then I think I'm good at, a policy professional. I always speak from that perspective, but I think it's important to realize that when it comes to MaaS, how we build the sort of either regulation or the ecosystem, that really does affect on what potential MaaS has, especially when it comes to sustainability. Because of course, as we know, I mean, I said the car is a great product. So if you want to compete with that, there needs to be different options, right? There needs to be options that serve, I don't know, a family of 4 and options that serve the student of 25, and they have different needs. And here, when it comes to transportation, because it's so big, it's a lot bigger than telecom, to be clear. For example, for our mobile phones, I just don't think that one single actor can be able to provide for all of those needs. We need multiple players, and really, so from our perspective, we would see that there is a risk when it comes to sustainability. For example, if MaaS is made into a monopoly of any sort, so whether it's private, giant American company coming in and taking over, or whether it's public, say a local public transportation company, a national one or something like this. We do think there's a need for choice. So what we speak on behalf of is what's called an open ecosystem. So really where you build the foundation, you have open APIs, you have the possibility to connect. For example, for MaaS Global, that we could connect in a city or a country and offer services to our customers regardless of where those are. Instead of us building, for example, in Europe, local ecosystems in every city, because then we're just building islands, aren't we? And I think the vision should be that anybody can travel borderlessly, seamlessly from country to country, especially in the European Union, but also in the US and also, of course, in Asia and other parts of the world. But that's the vision. So in our point of view, on the right side, this would be the sort of model, and maybe if it seems complicated, I'd encourage you to think about the telecom market. So if you think about how before we had mobile phones, we had local telephone companies, at least here in Finland, locally owned, and then the grid was opened up to different operators, and now today we can roam freely. We don't have to think about whether our phone works when we travel from country to country. We just know it does. And this is really essentially what we want to do with mobility. Want to create that sort of top level, maybe if I can use that, to bridge between different countries, between different regions, and allow people to travel really easily. And really here to see sort of maybe the vision as well. I think it was really interesting. I think Koen said at some point that Antwerp sees this as a platform for innovations. And I really do think that, for example, open APIs or the mobility data space that the European Commission is looking at, it's not just about MaaS, for example, it's about the opportunity to innovate when you open up new information. And I think I really do see that mobility is a space where especially where Europe has all of the sort of the good sides, all of the things we need. We have great connectivity, we have high quality public transport, digital skills are very high in most parts of Europe. So there really is sort of a consumer base also to respond to new innovations, as well as the technical know-how. So in a sense, I do think that mobility and MaaS maybe as well, especially can be at least one area where Europe could sort of get back into the digital game and really thrive, and an area where we actually have a lot more going for us than for example, North America or Asia. So in a sense there, I do think that there is a lot of potential and a lot of room to grow. But of course it does require legislation, and of course I think one of the maybe the main things that could have been a part of my previous slide maybe as well, but should bridge, or where the tripod should stand, is on a foundation of trust. And I think that's something that we do still have to work with MaaS, because we are going from competitors looking at each other and being a bit, suspicious of each other's, to everybody coming together and working together. And that takes time, and it's not always even logical when challenges arise. It might even be emotional, because it's about the connection to the customer, for example, or about the fear of what happens if we open up. So there is still, there is room for improvements, there's room for discussion, especially. But I do think that where we are right now is we're going in the right direction. And I do think that especially with COVID, that this is a very important direction, because I am quite concerned myself with the use of private cars increasing post-COVID, because of the fear of infections and the sort of the behavioral change that a pandemic like this, not maybe short term, but long term especially, that's where something where we really can have challenges that we can't really analyze yet. But really to conclude, I just wanted to share, and I think in these discussions on MaaS, I think there is a lot of discussion on, well, do people really want this? And is this really something? And this seems a bit complicated. And I just like to share the words of Henry Ford back in the day, who said that if I would have asked what people wanted, they would have said faster horses. So I do think that we need to keep an open mind, and also, let something like MaaS develop, and not go into this will never work mode, because I do think there's a great potential in MaaS for sustainability in Europe. But thank you so much, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you so much, Ida, for that very interesting talk. I really liked your previous slide showing the MaaS fever spreading across Europe. Hopefully we'll see that indeed becoming a reality. Let's indeed take a few questions. So you mentioned, of course, the importance of having a level playing field, avoiding a winner-takes-all mentality. But do you think there is space for more than one MaaS platform in a single city or a single region? Is that business case strong enough for multiple MaaS providers to be operating in a single city or single region?
Well, thank you for that question, and that's a very relevant question. I think it's good to remember with MaaS, so what we see now as MaaS is not really what I think most of MaaS operators envision, what investors see when they invest in MaaS. I think the goal for most of us, I would say, is to gain more market maturity and to be able to introduce value-based pricing. So as all listeners may know, that in many cases when we pay for a car, we might not pay for the actual engine, we pay for the brand, the feeling, all of these things that aren't really pertaining to the actual production of the car. And this is really value-based pricing. So in a sense, if we do reach a higher level of market maturity, I do think there is room for many players, because to remember, I mean, think about telecom operators. We have several in Europe, and this is a smaller market than what MaaS could potentially be if it keeps growing.
Thanks, that's very clear. And then you also mentioned at the beginning of your talk that 38% would be actually willing to stop using their cars. So do you have an idea if that's going to happen sort of in a transitional phase? Because otherwise we'd have to deal with, as Reba correctly says in the Slido, that 70 million people would suddenly ditch their cars. That would give quite a headache for many people trying to recycle the vehicles. So do you think that's something that will happen over time, or is it something that could be quite sudden?
I think it will happen over time. Of course, I mean, it's something that could be affected by policy. So, of course, if a certain type of car would be forbidden, then that would happen quickly, but that would happen regardless of MaaS, I think. So it's not really connected to MaaS in that sense. But I do think, I mean, a lot of work is already being done in many countries with, for example, the scrapping fee systems that we have in many countries, in Finland here as well, where you can switch your car and buy an electric bike instead. So governments are doing work to help people get rid of their cars in a sense, especially older cars. And I don't think it will be overnight. I wish it would, but I'm not. I'm optimistic, but not unrealistic, so to speak. But it was a very good question. Thank you for that.
Yes, thanks indeed to our viewers. I remind you all that you can ask questions via Slido. Please do so we can maybe also take some more questions at the end of today. I hope you can stick around, Ida, for those Q&As. Let's move on to the next speaker, who is Matthew Richardson from Uber. Matthew, take it away. Go right ahead.
Hi there, and thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. Just checking you can hear me okay. Perfect. So my name is Matthew Richardson. I lead sustainability at Uber. Last year, I was involved in the production of this report, which we called the Spark Report, alongside my colleagues, Zuzana, who leads EU public policy with Uber, and Adam, who leads sustainability policy globally. And any of us would be delighted to take any of your questions, either real time today or afterwards. I put our email address and contact details here. But in the Spark Report, we talked about recreating a partnership around electrification in Europe. We made a series of commitments to electrify the platform, but also laid out some of the challenges that drivers in particular face and cite and talk to us about in making that transition. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that today, as well as some topics, other ways in which digital can really impact transportation, and in particular the sector that I know the most about. So just to sort of by way of introduction, when we think about sustainability, we certainly think about cleaner and electric vehicles. We also think a lot about busier vehicles. And so it's something which is sometimes missed in these discussions, which is that at the end of the day, in terms of minimizing the amount of carbon per passenger kilometer, it matters a lot that drivers are busy, that vehicles are well utilized and well occupied. And so a lot of the story of Uber's history and the sector's history has really been about using digital technology, GPS, mobile apps, to match riders and drivers more efficiently, and to make sure that those vehicles, those drivers, can be as busy as possible, because that has a really large impact on making sure that the kind of total environmental footprint is minimized. And so we're going to talk mostly in this presentation about cleaner vehicles, electrification, but I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that it really is through technology, through making drivers busier and a more convenient service for riders, that really does create a sort of a flywheel, which has an impact in terms of reducing the footprint overall of the sector. So in terms of sort of cleaner vehicles, we took this moment during the pandemic to really think very carefully about what it would mean to have a greener recovery and what role that we could play within that. And so September last year, we made a series of commitments. And in the most sort of shortest term, that includes being fully electric in London and Amsterdam by 2025, 50% electric across 7 major European capitals and then a little bit further out by 2030 being fully electric across the US, Canada, and Europe, and then ultimately by 2040 fully electric all around the world. In this report that I mentioned, the Spark report, which is available online should you wish to read more about it, we also went into quite a bit more detail, a series of additional commitments and kind of commentary. We also sort of committed to report publicly on CO2 emissions, and we'll be looking to do that later in the year. We're also expanding sustainable options. So Uber Green, which is a service which guarantees a ride in a clean vehicle, typically a full electric vehicle in most cities. There are some cities where it also includes hybrids, but generally it's full battery electric, and that's where we're trying to get to over time. That's a service that is expanding rapidly, as well as the micromobility options, so e-bikes and e-scooters available within the Uber app, as well as public transport routing, in some cases ticketing as well, and we're really looking to expand that both in Europe and around the world. So specifically on electric vehicles, I mentioned the kind of commitments in London, and this is actually the first city where we made this commitment. So if you forgive me just a little bit of the details on some of the things that we've done in London over the past few years, because we really are trying to take this model and export it to as many cities as possible, as quickly as possible. But we have over 1,800 active electric vehicles on the app. We've raised over £135 million in what we call the Clean Air Plan, which is a plan which adds a clean air fee to every trip in London that is then accumulated into a fund against sort of the names of individual drivers that then allows them to use that money that they've accumulated over the trips that they've taken to subsidize the upfront cost of an electric vehicle. That's obviously very significant because it can be quite a large outlay for drivers to move into an electric vehicle. So that has accumulated a large amount of money and has helped a number of drivers to make the switch so far, with many more to come. We've also committed £5 million for improving charging infrastructure. We'll talk a little bit more about the challenge of charging infrastructure as it relates to ride-hail drivers in particular. We have a number of partnerships with OEMs, charging companies, as well as sort of cross-industry bodies that you see there. And we think that that's really important. This is such a large problem. Certainly, we can't achieve these targets on our own, but we really think that these sort of ecosystem of partnerships between companies like ourselves, car makers, charging companies, cities, and so on is going to be absolutely vital to delivering these targets. And then we have also launched this EV-only product, what we call Uber Green, in central London, actually back in March. But that joins a suite of cities across Europe where it's already available. So we think that high kilometer drivers, and I tend to not talk about ride-hail drivers or drivers on the Uber app, but really we talk a lot about high kilometer drivers or often high kilometer commercial drivers, because this really also includes taxi drivers, it includes delivery drivers, it might include someone like a plumber or somebody who goes sort of services in clients' homes, anybody who drives a lot. We think that they have a unique role to play in this electrification transition. And that's for two reasons. Firstly is by, on the left-hand side here, providing some of the initial economies of scale to reduce the cost of electric vehicles. But secondly is really around charging infrastructure, because there are some unique needs that these drivers face, particularly in cities, that will really help catalyze the sort of initial charge infrastructure, provide a level of kind of certainty of demand for those who invest in infrastructure, to give them the sort of the confidence and the business case to invest and make that investment as quickly as possible. It's important to say that Uber doesn't own vehicles. Everything starts from drivers. It's drivers who ultimately make the choice about what vehicle they want to buy or to rent or to use on the app within reason. And so it's absolutely vital that we work as closely as possible with all parts of the driver community to really understand what are the barriers that they face when they think about moving to an electric vehicle and what do they want. But the good news is that when we talk to drivers, we find that there is a strong appetite to move to electric vehicles. So somewhat stronger perhaps than the general population. And the group of drivers you see here on the right is a group that we call the EV Ambassador Group. This is the EV ambassadors in London, but we have similar sets of drivers across a number of other cities as well. and they work really closely with us. They're all drivers who've moved into an EV, and they drive regularly, but they also give us feedback on what the experience is like, and they also work with other drivers, helping them to understand what it'd be like to move into an EV and whether it'll be right for them. And when we talk to groups like the EV Ambassador Group, we really find three consistent barriers, and they're not surprising. They're fairly similar to those that the general population might face, but there is a bit of a twist. So one is the lack of appropriate charging. And it's important to emphasize that for many drivers on the Uber app, they don't necessarily have a private driveway or a garage where they can install a private charger. So, certainly more than half in many cities won't be in that situation. And that means that they have quite a different circumstance to some of the early adopters of EVs, who could generally reliably install a private charger at home and only top up on fast charge infrastructure when necessary. It's far more common for drivers on the Uber app to be either using rapid charging, but that has its own challenges because it means time off the road where you're not earning money, or it means overnight charging on public infrastructure, perhaps on the road near where you live. The second barrier is the lack of affordable vehicles. Again, no surprise, except to say that you often see publications that analyze the new vehicle comparison, so a new electric vehicle versus a new ICE vehicle and what the cost would be for a driver. But that actually often isn't the choice that's being faced by an Uber driver. They're thinking about buying a new EV because the kind of suitable models with enough range have only come out fairly recently, and comparing that with a second-hand ICE hybrid vehicle might be 3 or 4 years old, more affordable. And so the comparison isn't quite the same comparison that's actually being made by many drivers. And so affordable vehicles are particularly important, as is developing the second-hand market for electric vehicles over time. And given that context of perhaps the cost gap not being fully closed, in some cases, in many cases, the sort of financial incentives that are in place to support electrification aren't always enough to close that cost gap. So I mentioned sort of this idea of opportunity cost. So this is time off the road for charging. And so if you're a driver who drives all day in the course of your work, you may have different types of situations. So at the top here, we consider a driver who's in a long-range electric vehicle. So that's a driver who has a vehicle that can go a whole day on a single charge. So perhaps one of the more recent sort of 60 kilowatt hour models, something like that. And that driver will be in a good situation because if they're able to charge overnight, they won't have to stop at all, even to refuel. And so there's no time off the road, no time where you would be not earning if you didn't want to be. You would, of course, take regular breaks as you would normally in an ICE vehicle, but you wouldn't have to take extra breaks for charging. On the other hand, if you're in a short-range EV, perhaps you might have to stop twice for charging over the course of a day. And if you don't have access to overnight charging, potentially you're spending 20, even 30% of your time when you would otherwise wish to be earning money actually on finding charging and charging your vehicle. And that's a particular challenge for somebody who earns money from their vehicle and earns money from their time if they have to spend extra time on charging. No matter whether the vehicle is slightly more expensive, slightly cheaper, that time lost is going to be a serious cost as it relates to that driver's own personal earnings or perception of their earnings. So charging is particularly important. And in London, we did an exercise where we looked at where the charging infrastructure is today. So these are these red dots that you see here, and compared it with where drivers live or where they leave their car overnight, or where they may do based on sort of understanding of activity on the app. And so this is not a sort of perfect model, but it's an inference that we think is probably fairly reliable in terms of the point being made, which is that a lot of the charging infrastructure that you see today, the red dots, is in very different places to where drivers on the Uber app would most value it. And so you see here, there's kind of clusters in East London, sort of North and West London, a little bit further out. And in fact, many of these sort of hexagons where there are no chargers available at all, even though they are some of the hexagons where it'd be most valuable for drivers on the Uber app to have access to charging because there is a high number of drivers living in those areas. So there is certainly a large expansion in charging infrastructure required, but also in quite different places to where it is today. And we're trying to produce these maps for all cities so that we can help both cities, but also people considering investing in infrastructure really understand where it would be most valuable. And for what it's worth, there is a sort of independent projections that if we hit these objectives of being fully electric within 5 years, Uber drivers might represent up to sort of 70% of charging demand. So we do think that it's a material part of the user base of charging, and hopefully a better understanding of where those charges are most valuable will be useful to people. We've been particularly impressed, by all sorts of sort of innovation that we've seen across Europe, but really wanted to highlight the Netherlands when it comes to charging and on-street overnight charging. I think that for many Uber drivers, having the ability to charge up overnight is really valuable because, as I say, it means no time off the road. And that really is, the case in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, that for many drivers, because of this concept of sort of the right to plug, being able to say, it would be valuable to have a charger here because I'm an EV owner and I need one on the street where I live. This really means that the coverage is at a level where it's pretty reliable to be able to get access to overnight charging. I think this report that I see cited here talks about all the really impressive ways that data has been harnessed in terms of rolling out the charging infrastructure. It's a wonderful report that I definitely recommend you read. But in terms of centralizing some of the planning at the sort of city level and really using utilization data around how charging infrastructure is being used today, and then using that to inform the rollout, we've been really impressed by, and we think is very valuable for any city. That said, cost of ownership of a vehicle is still a challenge. And again, you see here this sort of cost comparison, and some version of this, which is obviously in the head of a driver contemplating moving into an electric vehicle. And drivers sort of talk about the challenge of these different areas. But if you look at a used ICE vehicle on the top here, this is an attempt to sort of model the cost of driving that vehicle. Of course, the used ICE vehicle, the ICE is typically a little bit cheaper than EV, but a used vehicle is a lot cheaper. And so you see here, if you compare it to an electric vehicle with, let's say, rapid charging, so no access to overnight charging, the vehicle itself will be a lot cheaper. And then also there isn't this opportunity cost of time off the road. And so, the message again is that having access to convenient charging is really important, as is access to cheaper vehicles. Now, of course, sort of the policies that are in place can help bridge this gap that a driver might face in moving to an EV. But actually, even sort of quite generous policies. So, for instance, 11,000 euro subsidy on the cost of an electric vehicle in Paris. If you kind of spread that across the relevant life of the vehicle, and you kind of run this comparison, you find that despite the sort of the very generous subsidy, it doesn't actually close the gap unless you tackle the charging question as well as some of the other fundamentals. And so it really is a kind of a comprehensive policy approach that's required to close these gaps, focus both on charging, but also then on sort of subsidies or fiscal policies that help close that gaps for drivers. One area that we think digital and public data could play a really interesting role is around this sort of what we call a flywheel of driving electric vehicle adoption. So, making sure that there is good accountability to local communities in terms of the amount of electric vehicles uptake in local areas. Of course, generally, the sort of registration data of vehicles is available within government, and so making sure that that is then made available to citizens in local areas to understand how much progress is being made in their area. Using this data around charging infrastructure, where it is today, where there is land available for it in the future, and how utilization patterns are progressing in individual areas. To the extent there is public infrastructure, there is an ability to get a sense for where charging is most valuable and less valuable, and that is very, very valuable to anybody thinking about making an investment decision into the next charger. And then perhaps most importantly is really rewarding individuals for using electric vehicles. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide, but you can imagine all sorts of ways that could be used. So whether it's a road pricing scheme, which has different pricing levels or some flavor of exemption for electric vehicles or cleaner vehicles, perhaps parking privileges for people in cleaner vehicles and so on. There are other implications to that, of course. But right now, it's not always easy for people who want to implement such a scheme to actually get access to data around, is this an electric vehicle or is it a cleaner vehicle? How clean is that vehicle? In a way where you can use it for what I might call real-time use cases. So deciding how much somebody should be charged for a parking, let's say, or whether they should be allowed to access a parking. Of course, there are sort of systems that can do it, but they often have to be built bottom up and actually having a kind of a smooth way to access the emissions profile of any vehicle, perhaps based on the license plate or something like that, we think would empower lots of new innovations to help incentivize drivers of electric vehicles or general drivers to move into them. So just to sort of build on that, access to some of this basic data, as I say, around engine type, fuel economy, and emissions profile electronically in a form where it can be used at scale. Because one of the challenges we've found, actually, as we've published what we call our climate assessment and performance report, which looks at the total emissions as best we can model it from all the drivers active on the app, is actually just accessing this data around how clean are the various vehicles that are being driven on the app. And so, we've been through a huge exercise recently to get the emissions rating of various vehicles on the app and to try to use that to be able to model the emissions for any trip on Uber. But that has not been an easy exercise, and certainly something which I think others would benefit from being made easier. So just to sort of wrap up, when it comes to policy, we do think that policy plays a particularly important role. And I'll just we have a number of principles that we highlight in the Spark report, but one I might just highlight here, which is focusing on electric kilometers, not just ownership. The reality is that some vehicles are used more than others, and it's when real high use vehicles become electric that you have the greatest benefit in terms of kind of carbon averted. And so focusing policy interventions on usage rather than simple ownership can have an outsized benefit. In terms of sort of policy areas to explore, I mentioned things that are particularly important. So making sure that high mileage drivers really can reliably charge overnight where they park, as well as having access to good fast charging infrastructure for top ups. But that does come with an opportunity cost. And so this access to overnight charging, we believe, is particularly important, as is affordable and second-hand EVs. The reality is that many of the vehicles that are being sold new today will become the second-hand vehicles that are suitable for high-kilometer drivers in sort of 2, 3, 4 years' time. But the quicker that those vehicles make their way through to the second-hand market, or the way affordable vehicles enter the new market so they can be then sold on later, the quicker that those transitions can happen. And then, as I say here, we might call tilting the economics of everyday use of a vehicle in a way that will naturally have most impact on high mileage drivers, but in general will truly incentivize the benefit that we're all trying to achieve, which is less carbon in the air or less pollution within cities. And so, to the extent that it is incentivizing electric kilometers, we believe that has greater benefit than simple electric ownership. And we do think that things can change quickly. So we've made these commitments where kind of conditions are right. We've made these commitments to be fully electric within 5 years. And, where the cost of an electric vehicle is similar or less than an ICE vehicle, so where charging is good, where vehicles are affordable, and where there are policies in place to look to close that cost gap, we really do think that we can become fully electric within 5 years. And in fact, that's a commitment we made, that if those conditions are in place in any city, we will be fully electric within 5 years. So just the last two slides, if we just look beyond electrification a little bit, we certainly think that digital and data has a role to play in every part of what I sometimes call this four-way match. And so Uber's sort of history and technology has often focused on matching riders and drivers as conveniently and efficiently as possible. And that has a huge benefit because it means drivers are busier. It means that every kilometer on the road has more passengers being transported, which has therefore a lower environmental footprint and so on. But increasing the kind of efficiency and convenience of the sector has been, obviously a very important part of what technology can do. But also, there's other parts of this match. There's the vehicle itself, and then there's the road or the infrastructure that these trips take place on. And whether it's electrification or road pricing, we think that this question of what is the vehicle and what is the road that is moving along are equally important, particularly as more and more innovation happens, whether it's sort of road pricing, whether it's one-day autonomous vehicles. We think there's a real opportunity for innovation in this part of the match the infrastructure, the vehicle, as well as the rider and the driver. And so, that is, because of important to sort of say that, we believe that road pricing would be of huge benefit to cities, and sort of modern digital road pricing that's based on usage, perhaps based on sort of GPS, but applies, based on the number of kilometers driven to all drivers, equally, although of course with safeguards to ensure that it is sort of equitable for everybody. But ultimately, whether it is emissions or congestion, not all trips are created equal. And this study that I'm referring to on this slide is from the Institute for Fiscal Studies in the UK, who did a detailed analysis looking at the sort of external costs of a kilometre driven in the UK. And they include things like emissions, but they also include congestion, as well as things like road accidents, wear and tear on road surfaces, and so on. And they find that many trips have a very low impact, but some kilometres have there's a long tail of a high impact. And that is often what you'd expect. It's trips that happen at very congested times or in certain locations at certain times. And so when it comes to road pricing, being able to dynamically respond to what is actually happening on the road, we believe is particularly important. And as we think about the role that technology has played with us, making sure that riders and drivers can match as efficiently as possible, we think in the future, this question of making sure that you're matching road capacity to the number of vehicles that are using different roads, potentially through road pricing, could have tremendous benefit for cities, and we are strong supporters of it. So I think I'll leave there, just left my contact details should you have any questions, or we'll be delighted to take any now as well. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Fascinating to hear indeed what you're doing to see that transition towards electrification really is taking place. Very interesting numbers as well there. Let me ask you a question from one of our viewers. So we heard from Ida that, of course, there's a big question mark on how the COVID-19 pandemic and the post-pandemic period is going to affect mobility as a service. Do you see something, the same question marks regarding the uptake of battery electric vehicles, or is that more, or is it easier to make a prediction in that sense?
Was this for me?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that we, as I mentioned, I think that we see very strong sort of underlying demand from drivers on the Uber app for electric vehicles. Clearly, there are challenges in the middle of the pandemic in terms of making a big decision to move into an electric vehicle. So it's to some extent there is a certain amount of kind of latent or pent up demand, and we are starting, obviously, as recovery starts to take shape. We are seeing again increased excitement around adoption of electric vehicles. So we'll see over the course of the coming months, but certainly this is a long-term trend that we don't expect. Ultimately, as hopefully the pandemic impact recedes, hopefully I think we will expect to see more and more drivers making that choice. But perhaps it's slowed it down a little bit over the past few months for sure.
Okay, great. Thanks. So let me ask you another question, and I'll ask you first, Matthew, and then move on to Ida. This was a question from Paula, who was trying to sort of address the paradox that there could be with the digital technology revolutions. So in the sense that they could increase the demand for a certain product, but could also create some negative externalities. One of the examples that comes to mind to me is, of course, the Bitcoin, which has created a virtual currency, but has the externality that, of course, consumes a lot of energy. So do you foresee, if we indeed have a future where all the drivers move towards battery electric vehicles, any negative externalities that we could already address now or counter to make sure that we don't end up in worse situations later?
So there's obviously many different types of externalities, and so I suspect that to a certain extent the answer is a little bit different depending on what the area of concern is. I think though that what I would say is that, as I mentioned, we're very I think that we're extremely optimistic that technology in general can generate more efficient outcomes for everybody. And so say we've seen over the course of our history that the ability of better matching of riders and drivers to create convenience for everybody, but also efficiency for drivers. So making sure that drivers are busy, are able to earn more money, and therefore are using vehicles and road space more efficiently than you'd be able to do without that technology. I do think it's important to I think that that's where the road pricing piece that I mentioned comes in. And road pricing is not, of course, the congestion or roads is not the only type of externality I think you're referring to. But I do believe that ultimately there are ways of using similar ideas to tackle externalities by making sure that they are being priced appropriately. And road pricing, particularly sort of that dynamic form that I mentioned, which really responds to real-time conditions, as long as it is applied everybody, because it kind of has to be. Otherwise, congestion has a tendency to sort of rush back in. But where it is universal and where it is dynamic and responsive to real-time conditions, we believe that could have a huge impact in tackling some of these externalities you might be referring to.
Indeed, thanks. And maybe the same question then to Ida. Do you see any externalities that could arise due to increased deployment of MaaS, mobility as a service, and how would you then tackle those or preempt those already now?
Well, thank you for that question. I think it's a really great question. I think first of all, I think I'm saying the same thing that Matthew did a bit, because it of course depends on mode and on what type of transportation we're discussing. But just if you look at, for example, car sharing, we know that because professionally managed fleets are managed much more efficiently, the vehicles are used more efficiently. They actually do, even with increased use, it still reduces the amount of cars and amount of course, resources made put into making those. I also think it's a good thing to look at from a policy perspective, and really to look at, congestion charges is of course one. I think that would be the stick, but also on the carrot side, I think there's a lot we can do to ensure that sort of consumer behavior is directed correctly and to sustainable modes. So one thing is for example, in transport to support not just supply, so not just invest in infrastructure or in public transport, but also to support, for example, consumer behavior with mobility budgets and other benefits that do direct that behavior to sustainable modes. But I think it's good also to be open and honest. I think we have to follow development, and we do have to see how all of this moves forward, because I think that's always the case with any new service. But from our point of view, I mean, we're the first carbon neutral MaaS operator in the world, and we do still have to compensate some, but we do envision that in the future we will be completely carbon neutral without any compensation. So it is possible to make MaaS completely carbon neutral. But then, of course, there may be other externalities as well.
Thanks indeed. I think with these exciting times and in the view of the post-pandemic situation, we will have a lot of surprises on how this is going to develop. But indeed, I do hope that seeing the challenges, which I also mentioned at the beginning of my introduction, to be honest, hearing all your speeches today, I am quite optimistic that we can face them and that we're moving in the right direction in any case. Maybe just one final question to both of you. Let me start with Ida then. What would you consider the single most important barrier today to the uptake of MaaS, to actually deploy your services around Europe, if you had to pick one?
Well, I would say, I mean, if I had three, I would mention the three I did today. But because I think if I can just give a little bit of preamble, I think technical capability and interoperability is quite easy if there is political will or if there's a will with the partners. But I think the most important thing is the level playing field and the trust as a package. I think that's the most important thing for MaaS to develop all over Europe.
Thanks. And Matthew, is that the same for Uber and uptake of battery electric vehicles, trust?
Yeah, I think that in the short term, the biggest barrier would be the affordability of the vehicle, and in particular, I mentioned secondhand vehicles. I think having said that, as more and more drivers make the switch, there is a risk that charging absolutely becomes the constraint, and of course, there's a much longer lead time. And so, if you'll forgive me both, I think that's probably the two that I would cite.
All right, perfect. Thanks a lot. Do you have any questions for each other? Maybe as a final surprise to our viewers, is there anything you would like to ask each other? Since we are only three of us left, as Koen and Tilman had to leave a bit earlier. Let me challenge you a bit to see if there's anything you'd like to know from each other.
Well, if I may be so bold, there is actually a question in the chat. Could we answer that? I think that's interesting.
Go right ahead. Let me know which one.
Oh, so there's a question, where do we stand in Europe comparing to Asia and US? I think that's quite interesting, probably. Sorry, I just,
Go right ahead. If that's something
no.
which interests you, please do.
No, I think it's a good question because just from a MaaS perspective, I think it's interesting that here Europe is really leading the charge, so to speak. So in many other areas, it hasn't been the case, but here Europe is, when it comes to policy, when it comes to deployment, is leading. But Asia and the US are right behind us. So let's not kid ourselves. I mean, Google just this spring said that they're going to be a one-stop shop for transportation, and they're entering MaaS. So there is a lot of powers there. But development-wise, I would say still Europe is leading the charge on this.
And in terms of policy?
In terms of policy, well, I would say as well. I mean, there's some interesting processes. Like California is creating some MaaS framework right now in the US. But still, I would say that because of the plans, if you at DG Move do what you're saying you're going to do, which I'm sure is the case, then Europe is still going to lead the charge, because that's going to change the baseline for all of the EU, of course.
All right, challenge accepted. Thanks. Matthew, for you, where do you think we stand in Europe compared to Asia and USA?
Yeah, no, I'd very much agree. That we've made some of our most ambitious commitments in Europe, and in particular, some of the most near-term commitments. So, a commitment to 50% electric across 7 European cities by 2025. There is a level of kind of commitment around the policy environment, charging infrastructure, of course, vehicles coming on stream, which gives us a lot of confidence in Europe, and we're thrilled to be able to make this progress in European cities, and then hopefully to export some of these learnings to other regions as well. Of course, there are some great policies. Mentioned California. There is some obviously really sort of strong electrification numbers in parts of in China and other parts of the world as well. But certainly, as it relates to our business, we're really excited about pioneering this work in Europe before exporting it to other regions.
Okay, thanks for that. And indeed, I see also in the Slido people saying this is very interesting to hear, and that there have been great presentations today. So thank you both for being here, and thank you also to Koen and Tilman for joining us. And thank you, of course, also to DG Connect for organizing today's webinar. I think we can close it here. Let me just remind all the viewers that we have another seminar or another session tomorrow from 10 to 12. Titled Handling Climate Disinformation, which could be a very interesting one to follow. Again, live via YouTube, and of course with the opportunity to ask questions to all the speakers. If there's no final question you want to ask each other, I can close it off. I can close it off here, and wish you a very good afternoon. And thanks again for joining.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.